transfer of energy from sun to different biotic components. From sun to biotic components means sun is a non-living thing. Biotic components means all the living things. So transfer of energy from the sun to the living things of an environment, of an ecosystem. So that is the definition of food chain. It is nothing but a representation of transfer of energy from one level to another level. That is, for example, from sun to the living organisms of an environment is nothing but a food chain. So sun is only the ultimate source of energy for us, right? Solar energy is the ultimate source of energy. Then these green plants which are around us convert the solar energy into chemical energy during photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process where plants prepare food. How? With the help of sunlight. So they take the energy from the sun, solar energy, and convert it into food energy or chemical energy. So when an animal takes this food, so animals eat plants, right? So when animals take the food, this energy is supplied to the animal and the process goes on. So always the plants prepare the food. How? With the help of photosynthetic activity. They convert solar energy into food energy, that is solar energy into chemical energy. So now plant has some amount of energy inside it since it has prepared food. Now when animals eat these plants, the energy from the plants will be transferred to the body of the animal, right? So when animals eat plants, when the animal takes this food, that means animals eat plants, this energy is supplied to the animal. So the amount of energy present in the leaves, stems, whichever animal eats, when it goes into its stomach, animal's stomach, this energy will be transferred to the animal's body and the process then goes on. What do you mean by process goes on? Then whoever eats this animal, some other big animal, or suppose human beings who are non-vegetarians who eat these animals, then that energy will be transferred to their body. So that is how the process goes on. So how is a food chain represented? A simple food chain is represented like this. The base level will always be producers, then will be primary consumers, then come secondary consumers, then come tertiary consumers. It cannot be more than 4 levels. So always the base will be producers, primary consumers will be the next, then secondary consumer, then tertiary consumer. And as you go up, the number also decreases. So examples you can say is, always remember the producers are always plants, that will never change. The base level producers are always plants. So plants, who eats the plants? Deer. Then who eats the deer? Tiger. So this is the producer, this is the primary consumer, this is the secondary consumer. Then one more example. In a grassland, say, plants are eaten by insects. Insects are eaten by frogs. Frog is eaten by snake. Then who eats a snake? Vulture or eagle. So this is how producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, it goes on. Then suppose in a pond where there is water, plants are eaten by scorpions and scorpions are eaten by fish and these fish are eaten by crane. So that is how, this is an example of a food chain in a forest, this is an example of food chain in a grassland, this is an example of food chain in a pond. So that is how food chains happen, and the base levels are always producers and the producers are always plants. So next, coming to food web. What is a food web? In real life, it cannot be as simple as a food chain. When we talk about real life, what all happens around us, because in an ecosystem, the food chains are interlinked at various levels. In our ecosystem, in the surroundings, there are many food chains and they are interlinked to each other. So many food chains together form a network which is called a food web. So food web is nothing but the many food chains all together interact and form a network which is called a food web. So the length and complexity of food chains vary greatly. This food chain is of greater length, this food chain is of lesser length. So the length and complexity are always different for each different food chain. So each organism is eaten by 2 or more kinds of organisms. So say for example plants. Plants are eaten by insects, or plants can be eaten by frog as well sometimes directly, or plants are eaten by deer, and plants are also eaten by many ants and insects. Then each organism is eaten by two or more kinds of organisms. That is, plants are eaten by different types of organisms, and which are again eaten by many organisms. So these organisms which eat plants are again eaten by many kinds of organisms. So what we can say is, food chain is not straight but a series of branching lines. So food chain is always not straight but a series of branching lines, because one organism will be eaten by two or more different organisms. Then those organisms will be eaten by multiple organisms. Then those will be eaten by sometimes humans, because humans consume non-vegetarian. So food web is nothing but a series of food chains which are not straight but branching and interconnected. So that is how what is a food chain and what is a food web we have understood now. Next, transfer of energy through the food chains. So food chains consists of base is always producers, that is plants. Then comes primary consumer, then secondary consumer and tertiary consumer. So how the energy is transferred from the producers to the tertiary consumers. So different levels in the food chains are known as the trophic levels. So each level of the food chain is known as the trophic level. Then out of the energy consumed by an organism at a particular level, 90% of it is utilized for its own purpose and 10% is transferred for the organism to the next trophic level. So out of the energy consumed by an organism at a particular trophic level, 90% is utilized for its own need, and rest 10% is left for the organism which is at the next trophic level. So you understood, right? 90% is utilized by the organism at that level and 10% is left for the organism at the next tropical level. So in this way, very little energy is left for the organisms at tertiary level. So if we assume that at each level 90% of the energy is consumed and only 10% is transferred to the next level, then moving to the fourth level, that is tertiary level, very less amount of energy will be left. For this, let's assume that plants make 100% of energy. Then if they consume 90%, how much will be left for next trophic level? Only 10%. Then next trophic level will be primary consumers. And if these primary consumers consume this 10%, out of this 10% they will consume 90%. So that is 10 minus 1, 10 minus 9. So that is 1% is left. Then from this 1% will go to the secondary consumers. From this 1%, again 90% of the 1% will be consumed. So what will be left? Only 0.1%. So out of this 1%, 0.9% will be consumed and only 0.1% will be left. Then to the tertiary consumers, only 0.1% energy will be left. So the energy which has come from the plants, that is 10%, by the time it reaches the tertiary consumer, only 0.1% of the green plant's energy will be left. So assume that plants make 100% energy in the form of chemical energy, that is food. So plants make 100% energy in the form of chemical energy, that is food. Then 90% of that it utilized for its own purpose and 10% is left for primary consumers. So 90% utilized, 10% left. Then primary consumers utilize this 10% and leave behind 1%. Then secondary consumers use this 1% and leave behind 0.1%. Then tertiary consumers use this 0.1%. So as the tropical level goes up, the amount of energy is decreasing. So the population of producers will be always largest, right? The number of plants will be more, followed by the herbivores and the carnivores. So producers, plants are always largest. Then herbivores. Herbivores means organisms that feed on these plants. Their number will be next. Then followed by carnivores, that is organisms who feed on animals. So this assumption of this transfer of energy is the reason behind one or two organisms which will be left at the top of the food pyramid. Because at the tertiary consumer level, the amount of energy left is very less, only 0.1%. That is the reason organisms which are at the tertiary consumer levels are very less in number. Understood? The tertiary consumer level energy will be less, only 0.1% will be left from moving on from producers to the tertiary consumers. So as the tertiary consumer has only 0.1% energy, the number of organisms at that level will also be very less. So that is it. Reason there can be one or two organisms at the top of the food pyramid, that is at the tertiary consumer level. Reason is why the organisms are less is because only 0.1% of energy of the green plants will be left coming to the tertiary consumer level. So the flow of energy will be always like this. Sunlight will give chemical energy to producers, that is plants. Then producers give energy to the herbivores, that is organisms eating these plants, that is insects, rabbit, etc. Then next amount of energy will be transferred to carnivores, that is organisms that eat animals. So after that the energy will be transferred to the top carnivores like wild animals, tigers, lions, or maybe human beings also. So that is how transfer of energy takes place through a food chain.